Welcome to the second night of the second Tocqueville event of the 2024-25 academic year. My name is Brent Nelson, and I'm the director of the Tocqueville Center for the Study of Democracy and Society and a member of the Department of Politics and International Affairs. I hope you received a brochure out there at some point. It lets you know what the Tocqueville Center is all about. It also contains a schedule of topics and speakers for the year. I think you will agree that we have an extraordinary lineup this year. We like to think that we in the Tocqueville Center bring in important thinkers to address crucial issues. Many of you joined us last night for excellent presentations by two of our guest speakers this week, Aaron Covey, who covers the House of Representatives, and Jessica Taylor, who covers the Senate. They looked at the likelihood of victory for each party in the two chambers by examining overall trends and key races. I think we all came away with a deeper sense of just how close this election is, and as well as the impact various outcomes might have on future politics and public policy. Tonight, we will hear from our remaining two guest speakers, Tim Alberta and Rui Teixeira, and then bring the whole group together, along with our own Jim Guth, for a grand panel discussion that will answer all of our questions about party politics and the election campaign. Or maybe not, but it will still be awesome. So, first, we will hear from our featured speakers. I will introduce both now, and then let them follow each other without interruption. So let me begin with Tim Alberta. Tim is an award-winning journalist, best-selling author, and staff writer for The Atlantic magazine. He also formerly served as chief political correspondent for POLITICO. He is a Michigan State grad, and a little personal note here, I spent part of my childhood, like until I was 8 years old, in Spartan Village, which is married housing on the Michigan State campus where my father was in graduate school. So I'm sure Tim was never in Spartan Village, but I still remember walking to first grade on the Michigan State campus. Anyway, he went on from Michigan to spend more than a decade in Washington reporting for publications including the Wall Street Journal, the Hotline, National Journal, and National Review. In 2019, he published the critically acclaimed book, American Carnage, on the front lines of the Republican Civil War and the rise of President Trump. And a little show and tell here. It's a big book, but it's a good read. And this year, he published the New York Times instant bestseller, The Kingdom, the Power, and the Glory, American Evangelicals in the Age of Extremism. Those are two books you definitely want for your library. Rui Teixeira is a non-resident senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, where he focuses on the transformation of party coalitions and the future of American electoral politics. Rui started his education at Yale University, but left to pursue political interests. He eventually earned his BA at the University of Michigan and his MS and PhD in sociology from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where we also intersected for a couple of years. Teixeira is the author of numerous books, reports, and articles. He is the co-author of The Emerging Democratic Majority, one of his most influential books, which was selected as one of the best books of the year by The Economist. His most recent book is Where Have All the Democrats Gone? The Soul of the Party in the Age of Extremes. It's interesting that the two of you have published books in the last year or so with the word extreme in the title. So, I guess that reflects the age we're in. Anyway, recently he published a highly influential report co-authored with his colleague at AEI, Yuval Levin, titled Politics Without Winners: Can Either Party Build a Majority Coalition? You can find a summary of the report on Rui's Substack called The Liberal Patriot, and you can also hear Rui weekly on his podcast of the same name, which I have become quite a fan of. Please consult your brochure for more complete biographies of both speakers. And now, without further ado, please welcome Tim Alberta.
Wow, that's one noisy microphone. Thank you, Professor, for having me here. Thank you for the invitation. I'm really glad that it came at such a slow time in the news cycle. I'm really honored to be here, and I'm grateful that all of you would take time out of your schedules to come out. Although for the undergrads here, I've got to say I'm pretty impressed. If it were a Wednesday night and I was an undergrad, I don't think I would have the discipline or the intellectual curiosity to be here. I would probably be chasing the nearest keg party wherever it was on campus. Maybe some of you are heading there next, but I'm grateful to see so many young people here as well. I am mostly here because I am a fanboy of Rui, and I want to hear all of his brilliant insights about what's happened to the American left and where it goes from here. As his warm-up act, I guess I will talk a little bit about the American right, how we got to this place, where we are going, and why. There's an awful lot to try to get to in just 20 minutes or so. So I will try to be as concise and efficient as I can be. I guess I'll start by telling you a story about two friends of mine, two friends of yours, people we all know, right? We love them. They're our friends, our family, our neighbors. These two guys, big Donald Trump fans, big MAGA enthusiasts. And they come out of one of his rallies wearing their red hats and still chanting the slogans, and they're all fired up. And as they walk out of the rally, they're a little distracted, and they're crossing the street, and boom, hit by a bus, dead, both of them. So they go to heaven, and they're standing at the pearly gates, and St. Peter says, "Gentlemen, welcome to the afterlife. Congratulations on being here. Is there anything that you'd like to know before you come into heaven?" And the first guy says, "Yeah, actually, St. Peter, now that we're here, you've got to level with us. Did Joe Biden legitimately win the 2020 election?" And St. Peter says, "My friend, I'm sorry to tell you this, but yes, he did. Biden won fair and square." And the second guy looks at his friend and he says, "This goes even higher than we thought." Now, I was told that joke by a diehard MAGA friend of mine, and it tends to be the rare political joke you can tell these days that sort of does well across party lines. The reason I tell it is, for one thing, it's funny, and we could all use a laugh at this point, because if you are anything like me, now granted, I live in Metro Detroit, which is the eye of the political storm. You all are in Greenville, South Carolina, so you're not quite as inundated here. But I think most of us, if you turn on the TV or watch social media or log on to one of these apps that you guys have on your phones that I can't even pronounce, you're all feeling the fatigue right now. We've been on sort of this death march to November. And so we can use a little bit of levity. But the other reason I lead there is you can't really talk about the modern right. You can't talk about today's conservative movement. You can't talk about today's Republican Party without just sort of having an honest and frontal conversation about conspiracies, about radicalism, about the sort of distortion of what conservatism is and has classically been understood to be versus what we see today. I guess to be more concrete, when I say this, I often have these sort of visceral flashbacks to the days leading up to January 6th, 2021. And for the couple of months preceding the events of January 6th, I was pretty outspoken in my writing, on television, elsewhere, documenting in real time all of the lies, all of the betrayals, really this sort of coordinated assault on the truth. And this is not from a right or a left perspective. This is from an objective pursuit of what is and is not factual, which is, of course, my calling as a journalist. Also, my calling as a Christian, which I write about more in my second book. But the idea that truth matters, that truth means something, objective truth, absolute truth. And the fact of the matter is that in the aftermath, in that 6-week stretch from the beginning of November 2020 into the middle of December when the Electoral College voted, in covering state by state, canvassing board by canvassing board, legal case by legal case, in covering and understanding what was happening, you could reach no other conclusion than, in fact, there were tens of millions of Americans believing a lie. And they were believing it for sort of tribal political reasons. And what was so disappointing was to see the ways in which people who knew better were participating in that lie, and were participating in it for reasons of political self-preservation, perhaps most notably, and also I think participating in it because many of them would have told you, and I wrote a bit about this at the time, and so did others, that they believed that there was really no harm done. In fact, there was a member of Congress who was quoted, of course anonymously, but I know who it was, who was quoted in the New York Times shortly before the events of January 6th, who said, speaking of Donald Trump, of course, he said, "What's the harm in humoring him, right? In going along with all this, what's the harm?" Well, it turns out there's a lot of harm. There's a lot of harm not just to our democratic institutions, but there's a lot of harm done to, I think, the psyche of a country in which people, especially young people, have become, understandably, very disillusioned with our politics, Democratic Party and Republican Party. You know, it's interesting. I've spent in this past year a lot of time on college campuses, in part because I keep getting these nice invitations to come and speak about this more recent book that I've written. And when you spend time with young people, you're reminded constantly that for a lot of you, especially the undergrads, your entire conceit of politics is wrapped up around Donald Trump. I mean, you have come of age politically. You have come to an awareness politically in an age that is in many ways sort of shaped around Trumpism and the responses to Trumpism. And that feels damaging for a number of different reasons. Setting the man himself aside, setting the policies aside, this era of our politics, I think, is sort of uniquely destructive because lost in the traditional, somewhat symmetrical right versus left, red versus blue, conservative versus liberal, lost in all of that is a sort of fundamental question of right and wrong and truth and lies. Now, this is not to say that the Republican Party has cornered the market on deception or on disingenuous, cynical, intellectually dishonest politics, because trust you me, the Democratic Party has quite a track record in that regard as well. But I think as I'm traveling the country, as I'm covering this election, as I've covered the last and the one before that, and as I think about what has happened to the modern Republican Party and what might happen moving forward if, in fact, in a couple of weeks, Donald Trump is elected again as president, I think you have to question what is left of conservatism itself in this country. Now, I talked earlier about having these sort of flashbacks to the pre-January 6th phase in thinking about how whenever there was coverage of what Ted Cruz and Josh Hawley and Jim Jordan and Mark Meadows and these other characters were doing, whenever there was coverage of it, whether it was in the New York Times or Fox News or any sort of outlet in between, the sort of default mechanism for identifying these people was to call them conservatives, conservative hardliner Jim Jordan, conservative firebrand Ted Cruz. And it's interesting because I've spent so much time with these guys over the years, with those two in particular. I've spent time around President Trump. I sat in the Oval Office with him for an interview during his presidency. Some of the other people who were sort of the key architects of really this frontal assault on the peaceful transfer of power, these are people who I've spent a lot of time with and gotten to know. And I think the question that was sort of gnawing at me was, at the end of the day, what is conservative about attempting to overthrow the government? What is conservative about encouraging the Vice President of the United States to discard the Constitution and, by executive fiat, throw out election results? What is conservative about attempting to keep a man in power who has lost a free and fair election? And it's interesting. I have any number of sort of loose anecdotes and recollections that I could sprinkle throughout here to sort of illustrate some of my own disillusionment and discouragement in thinking about how we got to this place. But one of the most remarkable things that I would point to, I think, is that after the Capitol riot on January 6th, 1 week later, on the 13th of January, 2021, there was a vote in the House of Representatives on articles of impeachment and whether or not Donald Trump should ultimately be held responsible for the events of January 6th. And in the week between the 6th and the 13th, I had spent countless hours, dozens and dozens of hours, on the phone with Republican members of Congress, Republican senators, their chiefs of staff, people inside the building trying to get an understanding of what was about to happen and why. And the thing that I walked away with, knowing it as certainly as I've ever known anything in my reporting career, and in fact I said as much before the vote itself was taken. I was on a couple of TV shows, a couple of podcasts, and I said this exact thing. I said that if this were a secret ballot, this vote on January 13th, if it was a secret ballot where members of Congress would be able to vote how they truly felt, dictated by their own conscience, rather than dictated by the sort of whims of political self-preservation, it was my very strong suspicion, based on my reporting, that you would see somewhere north of 75 Republican members of Congress vote to impeach Donald Trump if it was a secret ballot. But of course, it was not a secret ballot. It was a roll call vote. It's public, right? And so, come the 13th of January, 2021, you saw 10 House Republicans vote to impeach Donald Trump. 10. Now, I linger on that number for a moment. We have with us one of the nation's leading authorities on the House of Representatives, Aaron, over here. Aaron, of those 10, how many still have their jobs? 2. And in a couple of weeks, how many of them will have their jobs? Maybe 0. Smart money might be on 1. We'll find out. The point is, if you think about politics as the pursuit of power, the accumulation of influence, and if you recognize the fact that for many of these people, we want to think of them as leaders, right? But they're not. Many of these people are simply a reflection of the character and the dynamics and the whims of the people who they represent. And so you can't necessarily blame them for being so responsive to what they see back home. This idea that Trumpism is sort of this top-down phenomenon is exactly wrong. So many of these people in 2016, people like Ted Cruz, people like Jim Jordan, people like, you name it, go up and down the list of the people who you think are the standard bearers for conservative republicanism, for Trumpism even, in Washington, D.C. today. Almost every single one of them, either in public or off the record talking with reporters like me, warned about the explicit threats of Trumpism, warned about his autocratic and authoritarian tendencies, warned about this very thing that we are dealing with now. And yet, once it became clear that their voters back home liked him more than they liked their own elected official, they got about getting on board pretty quickly. And what we saw was this unwillingness to speak publicly in criticizing Trump the same way that they would do it in private. Throughout his presidency, it snowballed and it snowballed. And you had people who knew better and who knew the truth in sort of instances big and small, who were unwilling to say that truth. And eventually, what that produces is a sort of, for lack of a better way of putting it, a cult-like atmosphere in which any criticism of or dissent from the views of the dear leader is viewed as blasphemy, and you are no longer welcome in the tribe. So someone like Liz Cheney, who on paper has all of the conservative credibility in the world with her voting record, with her biography, with her last name, when she switches and turns on Trump and describes him as a threat to American democracy, well, she's no longer a conservative, right? She's a sellout. She's a liberal. She's a never Trumper who's infected with Trump derangement syndrome. So understanding the degree to which we have sort of gone through the looking glass and entered this new sort of post-truth reality in the Republican Party is, I think, the key to understanding this moment that we are in. The fact of the matter is that when my publication yesterday publishes these quotes from Donald Trump talking to his former chief of staff, John Kelly, four-star Marine General John Kelly, who has confirmed that Donald Trump talked about admiring Hitler's generals and Hitler's sort of total control of the military. People can cry foul and scream about John Kelly and fake news all they'd like. But don't forget that Donald Trump's own running mate, J.D. Vance, once compared him to Hitler. And when you bring this up, it's, well, you guys in the media, right? You can't, listen, us guys in the media get things wrong all the time. We have plenty of our own faults, and we have our own institutional credibility to worry about. And it's something I worry about every day. But until and unless all of us are willing to come together, right, left, somewhere in between, and confront these questions around truth and around what it means if we no longer have any shared baseline of fact and reality from which to disagree. I'll close just by saying this. Sorry, I wasn't timing myself either, so give me one of these when I'm running up against it. I'll close by saying a couple of things. I had this really interesting experience earlier in my career where I was spending time with John Boehner, the former Speaker of the House, and I was writing this very long magazine profile of him just after he'd retired, and we were sort of using his 25 years in Washington as a proxy to understand what had happened in American life, what had happened to the Republican Party. And I said to him at one point, I said, so what's, bottom line it for me of those 25 years, right? Like, what's the single biggest change? What's the thing that you feel like maybe played the biggest role in us getting to this moment? And he said, well, that's easy. He said, it's the media. I said, well, what do you mean? I thought he was about to attack the press, which would have been, well within his right to do so. But he said something else. He said, you see, in 1990, when I ran for Congress for the first time, he said, everybody in my neighborhood got the Cincinnati Enquirer delivered to us, and we all watched the same 6:30 news program, the local affiliate. And he said, and there was a couple of big Republicans on my block. There was a couple of big Democrats. We all golfed and drank and smoked cigarettes together and mowed our lawns and would all sit around talking almost every day about having read those same stories in the Cincinnati Enquirer and having watched those same segments on the local news. And then we'd argue about them from the right, from the left, maybe somewhere in the middle. But we had this shared baseline of information from which we could form our opinions and our arguments. And he said, by the time I left Congress in 2015, my phones were lighting up in the Speaker's office every day, all day, based on segments on Fox News or on YouTube or on conservative talk radio about something that didn't exist. He said, literally, I had to go out at times because I didn't believe it. And my staffers would tell me, yeah, it's something that Glenn Beck just did on his program about how you guys have a secret pension fund for only members of Congress that you can tap into, and it pays for you to go to Davos every year or something like that, right? And he said it just got to be relentless, where we couldn't even really deal with legitimate constituent concerns because we were just being overwhelmed day in and day out by stuff that just wasn't true. And it just strikes me that we as a society, we as a body politic, have become numb to a lot of this. It drives a news cycle for a day or two when Donald Trump says that Haitian migrants in Springfield are eating cats and dogs. But when the follow-up work is done, when the reporting from the ground in the Wall Street Journal demonstrates quite clearly that J.D. Vance's team, his team in the state, his constituent relations people went to Springfield, looked at this, talked to everybody, and realized that it was a bunch of crap and that it was a hoax. There was nothing to it. His team knew it, but he amplified it anyway on social media, and then the next day at the debate, Trump did the same, with a global audience watching. And we just sort of shrug our shoulders. And I think about, at the risk of turning your lectern into a pulpit, I think about the Old Testament story of Jeremiah surveying the ruins of ancient Israel. And he says that these people have forgotten how to blush. And I feel like we're sort of in the stage now where we have forgotten how to blush. We are dealing with so much systematic dishonesty and disinformation on a daily basis that we become numb to it. And again, I would stress that I am not simply talking about the Republican Party. In fact, I spent a considerable amount of time last year writing about the ways in which Democrats covering up for President Biden and refusing to say publicly about his condition what they all knew to be true and were whispering to each other privately is in many ways every bit as pernicious as the lies that led up to January 6th. I think the core structural problems with the incentive systems that inform our politics today inevitably produce and facilitate and almost enable this sort of deception. But the problem isn't the deception itself, it is our willingness to accept it. It is an unwillingness to confront the ugliest and most destructive lies that come from within our own tribe because we are willing just to turn a blind eye to it for the sake of winning this next election. Because ultimately, the ends justify the means, don't they? This has been not exactly the most inspirational set of comments that I've delivered to you here, and I fully recognize that. It's been a lot of bad news. But let me just close, if I can, with a touch of good news. It has really been remarkable to me, traveling the country and again, stopping at so many campuses and getting the chance to interact with a lot of young people. And I'm sorry, because of the schedule, this is sort of an in and out trip for me. I really wish I would have had time to spend with some of you. But I just have to say that I have been at sort of right-wing campuses. I have been at left-wing campuses, and then some sort of spaces in between. I also sit on a board at a college campus where I have an opportunity to interact with students a fair bit. And a lot of this year's political punditry and horse race coverage and forecasting has focused on the disillusionment felt among young people. This question of, will they turn out? Will they even bother to vote? Because sure, they may not like Donald Trump and they might be sort of left of center in their worldview, but they don't exactly feel that the Democratic Party is responsive to them or appreciative of them. So maybe they won't vote for Democrats either. And this is viewed as sort of a dilemma in our politics. And I have to say that I take sort of the opposite view. In the time I've spent with young people, I think that they actually have this amazing ability to call the BS that they see and to reject these false choices that are being foisted upon them every day, and to actually ask for something better, to demand something better of our politics and of our political parties and of our political leaders. And I think one of the really noxious elements of our politics right now is that so many of us have come to view it as a zero-sum struggle, and therefore we sort of swallow whatever objections we have and vote for the guys closest to us without demanding something better. And they know that we're just along for the ride. They take us for granted. They take all of us for granted. It's why Donald Trump can poke a finger in the eye of the pro-life movement and just figure they're going to vote for me anyway. It's why Kamala Harris can be almost entirely unresponsive to the protests around Gaza and Lebanon and just figure, well, they're going to vote for me anyway. What are they going to really go vote for Donald Trump? And young people have this really unique capacity in this moment, I think, to actually translate that disillusionment and that disappointment and this anger, frankly, that is justified, to translate it to something more. And that's, I guess, my long way of saying that, while this may seem very dim in the short term, maybe even the intermediate term, I'm looking out at all of you as the folks who are going to turn this around for us. But only if you make a commitment to that truth. Only if you make a commitment to interrogate your own biases first. If you are willing to reach out and extend an olive branch to people with whom you might really disagree, but if you're willing to disagree with them in good faith, on this campus, in your workplace moving forward, as you start a family, as you become the leaders of this society in the years ahead, think about the ways in which that pursuit of truth and that refusal of these dishonest, false choices that our current politics presents to you. Think about the ways in which it may be uncomfortable for you and difficult in the short term, but that in the long term, it is the only way to get this back on the tracks. With that, I'm going to return to my seat and grab my popcorn and listen to my friend, Rui. Thank you, guys.
Well, preach, Brother Tim, preach. That was a great talk. I probably won't do anything nearly as inspirational and emotional because I'm just cold-blooded political analyst. But I'll try my best to enlighten you anyway. Anyway, it's great to be here at Furman. It's just a beautiful campus. How does anybody get any work done here? It's too nice. It's too nice. You really should be in a grittier environment so you get stuff done. Anyway, I thought what would be useful in terms of understanding the evolution of party coalitions, which is kind of like my thing, and I think very relevant, obviously, to this election, is take you on a bit of a chronological tour of the last 20 years or so and how coalitions have evolved in our country. Brent, you mentioned that I wrote The Emerging Democratic Majority with John Judas back in 2002. And in that book, we were surveying, the evolving landscape of American politics. And we thought there was a variety of demographic, ideological, and economic changes that were sort of basically designed, if handled reasonably well, to grow the Democratic coalition. And the Republicans were kind of out of step with those changes. There was an increasing share of non-whites in the population. Basically, non-white share of voters were probably going up about half a point a year, 2 points every 4-year cycle, and they were voting heavily Democratic. That's obviously good for the Democrats. Professionals were growing as a share of voters, and they voted very high rates, and they'd essentially realign toward the Democrats in the previous period of time. Women were voting increasingly Democratic, particularly single working and highly educated women, and women were becoming educated faster than men at this point. So that seemed yet another thumb on the scales. For the Democrats, it seemed like the most dynamic growing areas of the country were also moving toward the Democrats, the big metropolitan areas where economic growth was taking place. So we put all that together and we said, well, it does look like the Democrats have a potential majority in the making that could be pretty durable if they played their cards right. However, we did have one caveat, which turned out to be very important, which is that even though the country was changing rapidly demographically, it was still going to be a white country primarily for a long time, especially a white working class country. Even though their share of voters was going down pretty fast, even faster than the share of whites overall, they were still a really big segment of the country. We're talking like, at that time, it was probably like 45 and 46% of voters, and they were higher in a lot of key Rust Belt and other swing states. And while Democrats had been losing ground among them over time, they still had a significant, pretty strong minority share of them. But if that share started declining, given how big that group was, that would undercut the benefits they would get from the other ways in which the country was changing. So we kind of like bracketed that and said, okay, pay attention to this. The white working class, yes, there's less of it than there used to be. No, you can't expect to carry them the way you did back in the 40s and 50s, but you've still got to have a strong minority share, maybe 40% overall, 45% of some of the Rust Belt states. Very important to keep that in mind. So, of course, people promptly forgot that. The moment the book came out, this was like widely adopted by Democrats who were, this was the Bush era where they wanted something to hold on to say, hey, the game is really on our side in the medium to long run. We'll come back. Of course we will. He's right about all this stuff. And then in 2008, when Obama wins, big victory, sweeping victory, and all the things we talked about, and even the states we talked about, seemed to come online for the Democrats. They did, in fact, get enormously benefit from the non-white vote, from the educated vote, from the female vote, and all these states where a lot of these changes were most salient were moving into the Democratic column. So it looked like, it had arrived. The rising American electorate had delivered. And one thing people didn't really think about or notice or talk much about at the time is he actually did relatively well among white working class voters, which means he lost them by less than someone like John Kerry had in 2004. And that was really important, but nobody paid any attention to it. But then in 2010, the hammer came down, right? The Democrats absolutely got destroyed in the 2010 election. And there are a lot of reasons for that. And you can read my book or some other sources to try to understand that better. But bottom line, in terms of the demographics, is you see the white working class bail out en masse from the Democrats. They just did terribly, and particularly in a lot of states where they're, the weight in the electorate is quite heavy. And, the Democrats lost 63 House seats. That's a lot. I mean, that's enormous. And it just completely changed the political complexion of the country overnight. And we had the Tea Party and all that jazz. Now, in 2012, Obama comes back and he manages to win again, albeit not as strong a victory as he had in 2008. And the conclusion that people came to from that election was exactly, only half right. It was like he had benefited from the rising American electorate. It was true. He did really well among non-white voters. He did really well among women. He really did well among professionals. But critically, he had gained back a lot of the ground the Democrats had lost in 2010 among these white working class voters, including in some of these key states. But people paid no attention to that. It was kind of like, oh, the rising American electorate. And even the Republicans got into the act because they started talking about how, we're getting killed among non-white voters, particularly among Hispanics. We really got to rectify this. There was a big autopsy that the RNC did after the election where they said we've really got to be more moderate. We've got to move to the center. We've got to have immigration reform and all that. But it didn't really take with the Republican Party, so they had their own perspective on it. Democrats had their own perspective on it. But both of them were missing something absolutely critical. Obama does not win that election without a swing in his favor by white working class voters in the upper Midwest. He just doesn't. And nobody paid any attention. That turned out to be crucial. 2014, the Democrats get killed again in the off-year election. And then, the big act, the pièce de résistance of politics in the teens, the 2016 election, We all remember how Hillary Clinton was supposed to win a landslide victory. The polls were unanimous. The forecasting models were unanimous. She was gonna crush Donald Trump, because who could possibly want to vote for Donald Trump? The guy's just awful, right? And Tim talked about some of the ways in which he's still awful. And yet, the way that election turned out, Trump winds up winning the election on the backs, essentially, of white working class voters in the Midwest. That's the decisive swing in the election that delivers the election to him. And somewhat surprising, despite all the terrible things Trump said about immigrants and people of color and what have you, and all the horrible things he said about other groups, he actually didn't do that badly among non-white voters. It was pretty similar to how Obama did. I mean, it was pretty similar to, among Hispanics at least, to how Obama did in 2012. And there was a diminishment, and he didn't do that badly in the black vote, really, all things considered. In fact, somewhat better than Romney had done in 2012. So this was a little disturbing. There were signs there that perhaps this rising American electorate was rising as fast as people thought. Then you get to 2018, and this is a great election for the Democrats. They gain over 40 House seats. It looks like the rejection of Trump is well in hand. People are bailing out right and left. The Democrats are on the upswing. But the funny thing about that election is, if you look at where the Democrats gained seats and the programs in which they ran, they're actually pretty moderate. It was mostly about health care. It was about things like that. It was about standard issue Democratic bread and butter issues. They didn't even talk about Trump that much. They just realized people didn't like Trump. They wanted something different, and they ran on standard Democratic stuff. But the odd thing is that the way the media summed up the election, there was an enormous amount of attention to Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Ilhan Omar and people like that, who were basically really left-wing progressive Democrats who got elected in really Democratic districts. And what they'd done is they'd won a primary. They won a primary. I mean, this had nothing to do with the Democrats' progress in the 2018 election. It was driven by other forces. It was driven by other parts of the country. And that was what was really critical about it. Not that, there were these, super progressive Democrats who might manage to get elected in Democratic districts. AOC may have gotten elected in her district, but the truth of the matter is, once you had the nomination, her dog could have gotten elected in that district. That's just the truth of it. So, but, it was all misunderstood and misplayed. Then we get to 2020. And this is a good opportunity, I think, to bring up some important numbers. Now, Biden wins the election, as we know, but not by nearly as much as people thought he was going to. He was much farther ahead in the polls than the election turned out to be, and they lost 12 House seats. It was not the wave they had in mind. But if you start drilling down into the demographics of the 2020 election, you can see the ways in which the Biden coalition and the Obama coalition, even of 2012, really differed dramatically. If you look at for example, if you look at the non-white, non-college vote, non-white working class vote, Obama carried those voters in 2012 by 67 points. It's a big margin, right? Now, in 2020, Biden carries them by only 48 points, and that's heavily driven by Hispanic voters. Hispanic vote overall dropped by 16 to 18 margin points for the Democrats in that election, and that wasn't supposed to happen, right? I mean, Donald Trump, after 4 years of Donald Trump, he's getting more Hispanic support than he did in 2016. It's just like people's heads were exploding. But nevertheless, it did happen. And then if you look at where ground was gained by the Democrats, and this is critical for understanding the evolution of the Democratic coalition. In 2012, Obama lost white college graduate voters by 8 points. In 2020, Biden carries them by 8 points. That's a 16-point swing toward the Democrats among, this important demographic. However, you look at non-white working class voters, and it's a 19-point swing in the other direction toward the Republicans. So that's part of what's happening, is the Democrats are trading non-white working class voters for white college graduate voters, which is kind of interesting, right? Another way of looking at it is that in 2012, Obama, if I'm remembering this right, he carried college-educated voters by 6 points and working class voters or non-college voters by 4 points. So there's only a 2-point difference between them. Now in 2020, that expands to like 22 points because Biden winds up losing working class voters as a whole by 4 points and carrying the college educated as a whole by 18 points. So you have this class gap emerging in the country, which is really tells you a lot about how the Democratic and Republican coalitions are changing in general. The Republican coalition is becoming more working class, and the Democratic coalition is becoming more educated, more professional, and more socially liberal, which is a very important issue, it turns out, and we're still seeing it today in this election. Maybe the next thing to kind of why don't we just fast forward to where we are today? I mean, here we are today. Tim's talked about how awful Donald Trump is. I mean, it seems like a lot of the stuff he says should be disqualifying. But if they're so, he's so terrible, why is he still doing so well? And again, we go back to the fundamental demographic facts of this election and of our political terrain today. He's basically doing so well because he's doing really well among working class voters. If you average the crosstabs from sort of the polls that have been taken in this cycle, it looks like, Biden lost working class voters by 4 points. Harris is probably losing them now by 12 or 13 points. So that's a significant swing toward the working class. And she's carrying the college educated vote by more, particularly basically because of the white college vote. So she might be up among college voters by 22 points, 23 points, 25 points. So we're talking now about a 35 or 40 point gap between the college educated margin and the working class margin, where the Republicans are on the working class side of that gap. And that's pretty amazing when you think about it. That tells you a lot about American politics today. It tells you a lot about the different coalitions, and it tells you a lot about why the Democrats are having such a hard time beating someone like Donald Trump. I mean, he is a guy who has connected to the working class of this country in a big way, and not just white working class voters, but again, he's doing much better among non-white working class voters. If we look at the data from this cycle, clearly there's going to be another diminution in the Democratic margin among Hispanics, which is going to be driven by Hispanic working class voters. And it looks like there'll be substantially overperformance for Trump relative to 2020 among blacks, particularly black working class voters, particularly men. So, I mean, this is all coming together in a way that, Tim's frustrated with our politics. But part of what that's about, and what it's mostly about demographically is this sort of stalemate between the working class and college educated parts of our country and what they want, what they believe about the world, and the candidates they're willing to support. And Democrats obviously have not cracked haven't cracked the code, haven't cracked the case in terms of how do we appeal to enough working class voters to add to our college educated base, what it really is increasingly their base, to actually be able to vanquish decisively someone like Donald Trump. And on the other end, Donald Trump has the working class increasingly, Republicans do, but they're losing college-educated voters right and left. So you wind up with this sort of stalemate between the parties, which I think drives everyone nuts. But that's just the way politics is today, and it doesn't look to me, at any rate, like this election is going to be terribly different. And that's why Yuval Levin and I wrote the paper that was referred to earlier, Politics Without Winners. Can either party build a majority coalition today? And judging from this cycle, I think we're still in politics without winner territory. So I would not, I agree with Tim. I think the youth of today should try to take some lessons to the way politics is today and demand something better. But the cold analyst within me says it ain't going to happen anytime soon. So stay tuned, hold on to your popcorn, and we'll see what happens on November 5th. So thank you.
I'm going to invite the remainder of our panelists, or the bulk of our panelists, I should say, to come up here. Tim, unfortunately, only has about 10 minutes left with us. He's got a plane to catch. And so I'm going to do something unusual. I'll introduce each person first, and then I'm going to open it up first to the audience. Anybody who wants to ask Tim Alberta a question. Okay, so hold that while I introduce everybody else. Okay, so the two young ladies to my left are our guest speakers from last night. Erin is right here to my left. She analyzes the U.S. House of Representatives for the Cook Political Report. She went to Liberty and she studied journalism and English there, and worked extensively at many national publications. And she is a contributing author of the 2024 Almanac of American Politics and was co-host of the Inside Elections podcast. And you can read the rest of her biography in the brochure. Next to her is Jessica Taylor, who is one of Furman's finest. She is the state and governor's editor for the Cook Report. She graduated from Furman in 2007 with a BA in political science, and she is a member of the alumni board. She's the first female author of the Almanac of American Politics. I didn't bring that for show and tell. It's about like that thick. So, but it's an amazing honor that she has that role, and she appears on television and in the press a lot. I saw her last week on Washington Week, which for political geeks is the show to watch. And that's probably the most prestigious gig that any political reporter can get. And then finally, Jim Guth is to her left. He's a William R. Keenan Jr. Professor of Politics and International Affairs at Furman University, and he has other distinguished honors as well. He has authored or edited 5 books and over 156 articles. He has won many awards for his teaching and scholarship, including a Lifetime Achievement Award from the American Political Science Association for his path-breaking work on religion and American politics. All right, that's the quick introduction of these folks. Does anyone out there have a question for Tim Alberta? Go way in the back with her hand up first. Please stand up and speak loudly and ask a question.
Hi.
Oh, we do have mics, yes.
So you specifically cited that college-educated young people are more quick to call out BS and nonsense. Do you have a similar experience with non-college-educated young people, or are they just not a relevant demographic for this election?
Sorry. Thank you for the question. It's an interesting question, and I might even lean on my friend here to weigh in. But, you know, I would think that, when the two parties sort of sift voters into their profiles in terms of their propensity to vote, right? Typically on a 1 to 5 scale. Sometimes consultants will do it differently, but 1 being they never show up, 5 being they always show up, right? You're typically sorting people by education levels, by gender, by geographic location, everything else. Young college-educated people do vote at higher rates than young non-college educated people. Now, assuming that they all turned out to vote, then they would probably be voting pretty differently, and a lot of that would be sort of falling along the familiar fault lines that Rui was just articulating. But the honest answer is I don't know. I'm not sure. For example, I think you see organizing among young people primarily through the lens of college campuses now, where 20, 30, 40 years ago, if you saw that sort of organizing among people in their early to mid 20s, that was typically through entry level union membership, for example. So some of that has just changed in ways that makes it a little bit hard to measure. I'm sorry, that's not a super satisfying answer to your question.
Rui, why don't you take that up as well? Because that's down
well,
your alley as well.
I think one thing that's potentially really interesting here is the gender split that's evolving between young men and young women. I mean, if you're looking at people who are going to call bullshit on Donald Trump, I think it's much more likely to be young women than young men. There are just these enormous splits in terms of ideology, in terms of views on various issues, sort of cultural style. These are really big deals among young men and young women, and I think they're there are probably even wider splits among non-college young men and young women. And clearly Trump is trying to appeal to this group of voters and hoping he's going to get them out there to vote, because these are people, they're not calling bullshit on Donald Trump, they're calling bullshit on what a culture they feel is hostile to them and a set of norms they feel like they're being urged to adhere to, whether they like them or not. So they feel like they're undervalued, they feel they're not getting anywhere, they feel they're being looked down upon, they feel they have no future. And I don't think these are the people who are going to call bullshit on Donald Trump, but more, the other person.
Yeah, both Jessica, Aaron, do you have something?
I would say a really good podcast that I listen to that kind of has delved into this is called the Focus Group Podcast by Sarah Longwell. She's been diving somewhat into the sort of gap between younger men and women in Gen Z and you all. She's a never Trumper, but she does extensive focus groups of undecided voters and looking at this. And so there was a recent episode where she kind of really, really dove into this as well. So I would just say that.
Aaron?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with what all these folks are saying there. I do think there is probably a pretty stark gender divide that increases with non-college educated voters, at least what we're seeing across non-college educated voters, that has been the case. And so I would think that would also be the case with younger people as well. But at this juncture in the campaign, it's interesting because there's a lot of the folks in traditional media like us are frustrated by the candidates' lack of interviews on mainstream outlets, but instead they're reaching out to these voters, a lot of non-college educated young voters who are listening to the Joe Rogan podcast or listening to Call Her Daddy, and that's where they are. And so they're clearly are important to the electorate still, even as the margins are so slim in terms of the number of undecided voters. Every little movement counts there.
I'm now a listener to Call Your Daddy. There was another one right over here. Yes, sir.
Thank you. The U.S. Constitution is designed in part to force compromise. That's what it's supposed to do. It presumes good faith on all parties who are participating. One of the things that's interesting in seeing this extreme division politically in the United States is that it doesn't work if neither party is willing to compromise with the other and presumes bad faith in the way they operate. And it seems that politically, both parties have decided that the base is where it's at. That's what we need to get. And as such, they keep feeding the bases and trying to get base turnouts increased so they win elections. But they do it by demonizing the other side. And it's not that there's not stuff to demonize. There is stuff to demonize about that is factual. But how do we get past that? How do we get to a point where we can work together and we can try to have a nation that comes from consensus?
Tim knows the answer to that.
I can take a whack at it. So listen, I have some good friends who are congressional nerds who I've had this argument with over the years, and they will sort of say, well, look, if you really understand the framers' intent, if you look at the design of Article 1, the legislative branch, it is really designed around conflict. It is designed to have gridlock, and they're exactly right. But my counterpoint to that is always that it was also designed to attract the best and brightest people. And I really think when you strip away everything else from these conversations, it comes back to the caliber of individual that you elect. Now, much of this has to do, I talked earlier about the incentive systems in our politics, and these smart folks on stage with me can really peel back the layers on this onion. But I think it's worth understanding that, Rui talked earlier about in how in 2010 there were 63 House seats that flipped. In 2018, this big midterm election wave, there were 43 House seats that flipped. And everybody treats this as like this huge big deal, right? 43 seats go from red to blue in one night, right? 43 seats out of 435 in the House of Representatives is 10%. So in this big, volatile, historic election cycle where Democrats have recruited this amazing class of candidates and raised record amounts of money and this, that, and the other, and Donald Trump is historically unpopular, you're telling me that 90% of seats in the House of Representatives remain static, remain loyally locked down by one of the two parties. If you think about politics as a game of Monopoly, where both parties are basically just fighting over real estate and then trying to protect it, right? We are, I think the fundamental lack of competitiveness in our system produces this environment now where 90% of people who go to Washington, give or take, they represent a seat that is safely red or safely blue, and they recognize that they're never going to lose that seat. If you are a Republican in Congress today, 9 out of 10 of them know that they're never going to lose that seat to their left. They're not going to lose to a Democrat in a general election, and they're not going to lose to a more moderate Republican in a primary. The only threat they face is from their right, from a more conservative Republican attacking their flank. And it's mostly a mirror image on the Democratic side, which is why when all of these people wanted to vote to impeach Trump on January 13th, 2021, they wouldn't, because they recognize the threat that exists there. And people can look at that and call them a bunch of chickens and cowards, and they wouldn't be wrong. But fundamentally, until you start recruiting and electing better candidates, and that it's sort of a chicken and egg conversation. Well, can we do that with the existing structure of our politics, with this lack of competitiveness, with this sort of duopoly where these parties control real estate that is either deep blue or deep red, and there's no competition there? That's a different conversation around electoral reforms. But I think if you view that as the chicken, then the egg to this conversation is, well, maybe get comfortable with the idea of crossing over and voting in the other party's primary if it means to try to elect a better candidate, to try to produce more competition in a general election environment. Because right now, we don't have it. If you ever turn on cable news and see Marjorie Taylor Greene talking and ask yourself, how did this person get elected to Congress, right? The answer is look at her district. It's actually pretty easy, because you recognize that there is a very small threshold to clear. And as Ray said, in the case of AOC, once you win the nomination, you literally could not have a pulse and still win in that district, as long as you've got the right letter next to your name on the ballot. So that's, I think, at the root of all of our problems.
Okay, I have to call time out just for a second. Jessica, you will be able to talk on this, but it is after 6 o'clock, and there is a plane to Houston waiting for you on the tarmac. So let's give Tim Alberta a hand. And as he leaves, I just might remind people that Alexis de Tocqueville here thought that American politicians were very mediocre in 1831. So it's not a new problem. Jessica.
No, I was just going to add to that. I think just until we sort of address where the root of how we elect people is, I think we are just going to continue to have the fewer people participate in primaries, but it's those few that are electing those people. I'm really intrigued by watching some of these election reforms that are happening with ranked choice voting and with all candidate primaries. I mean, when I'm in the Senate, I look at someone like Lisa Murkowski in Alaska that she lost her primary in 2010 and she won as a write-in candidate, but was she voted to convict Trump in the impeachment, even though she was up in that cycle. But it was only really because of Alaska's top 4 primary system, where she could advance and then was able to win because of ranked choice voting in that regard, that she was reelected. And so you sort of preserve that middle in a way, versus other senators that were going to do that. It was in the House as well. It was a death sentence, really. So I'm really intrigued by some of that. Now Alaska might end up repealing that, and we might see it go into effect in Nevada this cycle as well. But I look to it. We see it on both sides, not just in the Republican Party, that Joe Manchin was pilloried for being too conservative. Well, that's, if you want to elect a Democrat in West Virginia, that's what you're going to have. He's going to be replaced by a much more conservative person. And Kirsten Sinema as well. She was going to be primaried. She became an independent, and now she's not running again, and she's going to be replaced by a more progressive member. So, and it also depends on whether primaries are open. You talked about sort of crossing, whether you cross over in primaries and stuff. Not every state gives you that option as well, if you have to register as well. So I look at those different types of electoral reforms that sort of have to happen in that regard.
Yeah, I mean, with the progressive ascendancy in the Democratic Party, essentially they lost interest in, running and winning in states that were like reddish and running moderate candidates. I mean, think of how Joe Manchin was pilloried during the last Congress. by progressives because he wouldn't sign on to like a $3 trillion Build Back Better bill and so on. I mean, basically what they need is 2-3 many Joe Manchins, right? They need conservative Democratic senators in a lot of relatively conservative states. Basically with the base they have now, they can get about an even split in the Senate, but they're so uncompetitive in so many areas of the country now that their ability to form, real strong majority coalition is just totally vexed. And, bizarrely, they even wind up practically kicking out some of their best performing senators who actually are able to win in states that aren't normally congenial for the Democrats. So this is a problem on both sides. I mean, simply put, neither party seems really inclined to try to purposively form the broadest possible coalition. And I think that's how ultimately you'll get to more compromise because, that'll change the culture of the parties, and it also kind of forces the party that is essentially outcompeted in a fairly decisive way to compromise because they don't have any choice. But right now in both parties, they think they're like this far from crushing the other side because, this God is on their side, right is on their side, morality is on their side. And, for sure, people will eventually realize this. They'll come to their senses and allow them, the other party to be crushed as it so richly deserves. But, we still seem pretty far from that purposive, sort of quest for the center.
I'm just going to keep it open to the audience. We're going to can the panel discussion because you all are asking great questions. I'm going to go, it's the edges that are producing the questions. I'm going to go way back here, young gentlemen.
Hello. Do you think the public's trust in political journalism has eroded? And if so, why?
Journalism.
Yes. And I do think it's just because you can get news more now than ever that just reinforces your political viewpoint. In my career, and I set out to do this when I was at Furman, that I wanted to work for specifically nonpartisan organizations, but I think you do have to be conscious of your biases that you bring to that. But I think that social media has absolutely contributed to that. That you just now see just a stream of hate for things and directed at the person. And I also think that what has also eroded is because of an erosion of local journalism and because of layoffs at the local level, we do still see that local journalism is more trusted. But when you see an erosion of that you're not seeing the local coverage, that you're only seeing it through a national lens, I think that breeds more of the distrust. I was at NPR during the 2016 election, and like many other places, we missed it. And we really did kind of go back to a focus. NPR has member stations that they can rely on, but trying to go back to localize it, to institute these sort of regional journalism hubs so that you weren't covering it sort of as a fly-in, from a national perspective. And I think that sort of contributed to the erosion of trust in the national media as well.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with everything Jessica said there. I think it's ultimately a financial issue. In the internet age, people don't have to pay for their news. And so these mainstream media outlets that folks used to be dependent on, the local paper, the local networks, are not making the money that they used to. And so they're shutting down, they're laying off the bulk of their reporters, and they're relying on national syndicated stories to run in their papers. And so the erosion of local media is a huge part of the story. And that's ultimately just a financial issue that we have not really solved yet. And I think we're seeing more and more outlets, even digital outlets, move towards a subscription model because that's the only way to really maintain their lives. And we saw in the failures of places like BuzzFeed, the clickbait does not work. It's also not good for our democracy, but it also was not a financially sustainable model as well. So, that's like the bad news there. I do think the good news is that because now people have so many options for where they can get their news from, that has forced a lot of the mainstream outlets to confront their own biases and diversify their own newsrooms. Mainstream outlets tend to be much whiter than America. They tend to be much more liberal than America. The people who work at these outlets, they're more upper class. And so the fact that these newsrooms are kind of having to readjust to where the American public is at now, I think is a good thing. And I think hopefully that will lead to increased trust over time in these institutions.
I'm going to go to my right. Kylie, please, and then right down here. Okay, Kylie first.
So this was mainly to Tim, but I would like to know your thoughts too. He talked about how he encourages young adults to demand the truth and demand something better, and I question why our parents or even because there are some older candidates as well, our grandparents and our generations above us should be creating a better place for us. We shouldn't have to be demanding something better from you guys, and that's kind of what it feels like right now. I've also talked to a lot of my peers, and I find that even though we all have strong opinions, not all of us are strongly left or right. We all kind of talk a lot but never pick a side. What have you guys heard from young adults on, like, have you ever found very far left or right students? Because personally, I haven't found any of my peers that are like that. And what do you have to say about our older generations demanding something better for future generations?
I'm going to direct that one to Jim Guth because he's the only one up here who has to hang out with 18 to 22-year-olds every day. So, and you're also of a generation up there.
Yeah. Now you're asking me to work outside my area of expertise here, but yeah, I think that one of the things I notice is that there is, among a lot of students, a lot more uncertainty and flexibility and ambiguity about political perspectives, and people tend to not conform to the package that either liberal Democrats or conservative Republicans are putting forward. And I think that's maybe a result of the kind of disappointment with national politics, and maybe it frees people up a little bit to think for themselves on a lot of these issues. I'm not sure how that translates into necessarily into effective political action when we have all these structural factors we've been talking about, which really seem to get our politics stuck in two ruts, the primary system and those sorts of things. And I think that's something that is going to be difficult to overcome. I think that's just something that's built into the nature of contemporary politics. And I think there are some other, can I introduce, since Tim Alberta has left, I'm now the expert religion scholar here.
Yes, you are.
And I'd like to kind of ask Rui and the ladies here about their perception of this. One of the things that I've been chronicling for a long time now is the increasing religious divisions between our political parties. And especially in recent years, that gap has become enormous. And in a lot of ways, if you do the kinds of equations I do in statistical modeling, religious perspectives and religious participation or non-participation have stronger effects than social class, income, almost in education, although education is sticking in there. I'd like to get our panel's perspective on where this religious secular divide that we increasingly see between our political parties fits into the kinds of demographics that you look at and what people are perceiving out there in the countryside, because it strikes me that this kind of division is one that is probably not going to go away. There's good recent work by some of my colleagues on the increasing secularist influence within the Democratic Party, and that's getting bigger all the time. And on the other hand, we have still the steady 80% vote of evangelical Protestants for Mr. Trump, and you have Hispanic Protestants increasingly Republican. You have these religious divisions seemingly kind of overlaying some of these social class and other divisions.
I'm going to let Aaron take that one up first because you also have an interest in this. So I'll let Rui go later, but can you address that? Or do you want to address that?
Yeah, I mean, I think Rui can speak to some of the big picture numbers here that I don't know as well off the top of my head. But I will say on a granular level, it's clear that these religious identities have become more cultural identities for both parties. And particularly on the Republican side, I watch a lot of campaign ads, which is, tough sometimes, it's bleak. But one mantra that I will hear a lot of times in the Republican primary ads is that a candidate is pro-gun, pro-God, and pro-life, and maybe throw something else in there, pro-Trump.
Yeah.
So, God's just kind of one of many things that gets thrown in there as a marker of a Republican identity. And I think earlier we were talking about how Republican Party meetings have changed over the last couple of decades, and Dr. Guth was talking about how Republican meetings now open up in prayer in a way and are much more like overtly religious in a way that they were not decades ago. And so I think that we have definitely seen that affect the way the Republican Party's coalition has shifted, and it's the reason that in part Republicans have made gains with religious Hispanic voters, both Catholics and more Protestants as well. And then on the Democratic side, of course, we've seen it become increasingly secular over the past couple of decades. And I think you see less of that maybe overt signaling in terms of the campaign ads themselves, but it's certainly clear in the way politicians talk about these issues, or the way they don't talk about or don't talk to religious voters as well. So I'll let the rest of y'all take that, though.
Well, the biggest mix effect in politics at this point in terms of religion is the growth of the nuns, people who really have no formal religious affiliation. I mean, if you look at look at the data over time, it's just kind of going up like this. It's enormously much larger portion of the population. Is it now pushing 30%? Would say that they're
A little
they're
bit
basically
closer, Mike, a little bit closer.
Oh, they would say they're they don't have a religious affiliation. They're agnostic, atheists, or just flat out unaffiliated or spiritual, whatever. So, and we look at the voting behavior of those people, and they do lean heavily Democratic. So that is something that is definitely benefiting the Democrats. On the other hand, we look at the trend line in terms of part of sort of vote for the Democratic Party, and it doesn't seem to be fixing that much for them, right? It's not really fundamentally changing the balance of power in politics. So there's a lot of other things going on in that religion bucket. I mean, one question I always have is, does ideology drive religion, or does religion drive ideology? I mean, in other words, who are these people who are sorted into these different religious buckets, and is really their religion or religiosity, which are two different things, right? I mean, your former religious affiliation and how often you actually attend church are like, much different variables. And religiosity has a stronger effect by and large, doesn't it? Like literally how often you, at least controlling for other factors.
Well,
And the Republicans now have more and more people who aren't particularly, sort of, who don't attend very much.
You do have those trends, and I think in some ways, what's relevant politically is not just the nuns, the people who have no religious identification and are not consciously atheist, agnostic, who tend to be more literally, explicitly secularist.
Mm-hmm.
If you look at the data on convention delegates and all sorts of things like that, you find the Democratic Party increasingly has a fairly large contingent of people who are not religious, but also in some way anti-religion, or at least anti-public religion.
Mm-hmm.
And this creates a problem, of course, for the Democratic Party, because they have lots of religious minorities that are still highly observant, and they may very well differ on a lot of those questions. And I think a lot of the, for example, the signals that Democratic Party leads send can vary. Vice President Harris, for example, decided not to go to the New York Al Smith dinner, and that sent some signals. Also made fun of the people who were chanting, Jesus is King at her rally. Those sorts of things are sort of exemplars of that difference in perceived religiosity of the parties and how religious a person thinks he or she is really the relevant thing. It isn't even so much how often they go to church. And part of it is also what religious community they're in. And even when you take religiosity into account, being an evangelical Protestant in the evangelical tradition still makes you more Republican, regardless of how, religious you are. So those
But are they really evangelical? I mean, or is it
well,
just like
now you're getting
almost a
into the
political
theological
ideological
question.
identity?
I
to
mean,
say
you're looking at
evangelical.
the way we measure it, and not the way that the Pew Center measures it.
Right.
Something is in their religious affiliation, not what they call themselves. And we talk about the evangelical tradition rather than people who think of who call themselves evangelicals. So.
I mean, I was here in Greenville in 2015, right after Trump announced. I came here for NPR for a story to cover a Trump event he was having at the convention center. And this was right after he'd been in Iowa, and he was asked about, what have you repented for, basically? And he said, I don't have anything to repent for. And again, me raised in diehard Southern Baptist church, I was like, all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God, admit, believe, confess, and I was asking people, I remember at this rally, and then I think I came and talked to Dr. Guth afterwards for that story to try to help make sense of it all. I remember repeating this. People in line I was talking to were telling me, they're like, well, Trump's a Christian. And I was like, but yet he said this, that goes against everything. And so I think that's where it became more of just an idea of what a Christian is. And that Trump is probably the least Christian president we've had when it comes to attending church and believing things versus, in 2020, Biden was an incredibly devout Catholic that went to services every single week. And you probably can count on one hand the number of times Trump has been in a church, in the past few weeks, but past few years, really. And so I think it just became more of a perception. And I think Dr. Good's exactly right that what do you define as an evangelical? I think that has become more of a political term than what it would be defined as in biblical terms necessarily. And I think that's just where we have seen that. But I do think that the Democratic Party has an issue there where it has seemed openly hostile to a lot of those. I mean, I know people that I went to school with here at Furman. I mean, we were all raised Christian and different things. I do see that there is, at least I think in more sort of educated circles, there is sort of a rise of sort of this Christian progressivism in different ways. But I still don't think that is enough to sort of turn the tide in many of these regards necessarily when we talk about sort of the shifting demographics.
Yes, you right there. You've been waiting a long time.
Hi. It was previously mentioned that it's been hard to find common ground among parties based on the differing medias in which parties will get their news. And I get notifications from all of the different news sources on my phone. And recently I've seen on Fox News that they've been coming out with these ratios of Trump-Vance interviews versus the Harris-Walz interviews. However, when you look at the interviews that Trump and Vance, because they've done some 70-something, when you look at them, they're mainly news sources that they're going to that believe the same things that they believe. And I was wondering if you all would find it beneficial for finding common ground if these candidates would go to other news sources kind of different from their own political views and do interviews and sit down with interviews, kind of stepping outside of their zone of beliefs.
I mean, I think Harris did that when she went on Fox News with Bret Baier last week, and that was not a, easy interview for her and different things. But, Trump has bucked the convention. And I think what we've seen since the debate, that was sort of his low point in that regard. And I finished watching that debate and I said, there's no way that Trump agrees to a second debate, and he's not going to, or that, he didn't go on 60 Minutes in that regard. So, I mean, Harris has been opening herself up, I think, more to these, but whether it's going to end up benefiting her, I'm still not sure. Should she do it should both of them do it just out of a principle of democracy? Absolutely. But you're absolutely right that Trump is on sort of these, more favorable things. And I think that the strategy is kind of to run out the clock and not have another major error like he did in the debate and different things, then that could work.
Yeah, I mean, J.D. Vance has really handled things differently than Trump. J.D. Vance will talk to anybody basically, so he's definitely performed his duty in terms of talking to hostile and non-hostile media. But his boss feels differently, I think, and maybe one thing it shows in general is that neither party is super oriented toward persuadable voters. There is a premium put on people who they feel already sympathetic and they can mobilize, and there's not a sort of real fundamental underlying commitment to I'm going to try to reach as many persuadable voters as I can, and therefore I've got to talk to people in all kinds of different venues, hostile, non-hostile, and in between. And it's just that's our politics today.
One more question. Yes, right here. Yeah.
With the increasing polarization, how likely do you think it is that Trump or Harris will have coattails in the state that they win, that even though the Senate candidate might not be favored or the House candidate might not be favored, they still end up winning because people are just going to vote straight ticket no matter what?
Yeah, I think that one's to me. I mean, in 2016, we saw every single Senate race went the same way as the presidential race. In 2020, only Susan Collins managed to do that. And I think when I look at these Senate races, the ones that are closest in Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin in particular, I think that where I have seen Trump doing better in those states, that's helping pull, particularly in Pennsylvania and Wisconsin, in the polls that I've seen moving. But the question to me is, in a state like Arizona, where probably what is Trump's best state right now out of the 7 swing states, can he have enough coattails to pull a candidate like Carrie Lake over? That's where or in Nevada, actually, we were seeing some more encouraging signs in early voting data for Republicans. And even though Sam Brown there is very underfunded compared to Jackie Rosen, and that had been a bigger gap necessarily, is that a place where that could? So I look to maybe those 2 states that we see the biggest gap in, to see if we do have a Trump win, if he could pull those sort of underperforming candidates over. But do I expect it to happen? I don't at this point, but I, could in those races where it's closer in a Michigan, in a Pennsylvania, and a Wisconsin, could that happen if we see a Trump win of 2 to 3 points in those states, which would really be considered a landslide? It could. I mean, I'll let Aaron speak to some of the House races as well here too.
Yeah, one of the things that the political science literature shows is that coattails have really diminished almost nothing, and it's only in few special instances, as Jessica has talked about, where you could see something like that. But the trend over the last 40 years is for very substantial coattail effects earlier, even as late as the 1980s, and they've just gone steadily downhill to almost nothing.
Yeah, I mean, it's even more dramatic in the House. Members of the House have even less of a distinct political identity than senators, and certainly less so than governors. And so it is very rare to see a congressional district vote one way at the presidential level and the opposite way at the congressional level. There were only 16 seats in 2020 that voted for one party at the top of the ticket and the opposing party to represent them in Congress. And I don't think that number is going to go up that much. That was the low point over the past 7 decades in terms of split ticket voting across congressional districts. So, that is why in some ways the race for the House is so close right now. We don't see either party as favored in enough seats to reach the 218 that they would need for a majority at the outset. So it's going to come down to the 2.5 dozen seats that we have in our toss-up category, and largely these candidates' prospects are dependent on how the presidential race is playing out in these places. And it's kind of interesting because with the House, the battleground mostly overlaps with states that are not competitive at the presidential level. And so there's less polling. We have less of an idea of where these districts are at politically because of that. But it'll be interesting to see in places like the Central Valley and on Long Island, where Republican members of Congress represent districts that Biden won by double digits in 2020. If Harris is only winning them by a couple of points, it's a lot easier for these Republican members to overperform by a couple of points and win them. On the flip side, you see Harris making gains in places like Omaha and Des Moines, and whether or not the Republican members who represent those seats can win will depend on how well Trump does in these districts. So their prospects are very tied to the presidential race, and I don't expect that trend to reverse anytime soon.
How about reverse coattails in North Carolina? You have any comment on that?
Yeah. Mark Robinson,
I mean, if I
your
can
man
say,
for the
yeah, I mean,
state house.
I'm very skeptical of that still. I mean, but if, and I think that still Robinson has a floor that he, I don't think this is going to be a like 24-point race as some of the polling has shown, even our own polling did. So, I mean, I'm very skeptical of that reverse coattails effect, even in North Carolina. Could the governor's race affect other statewide offices like the superintendent of public instruction, attorney general, that it could there, but I don't think it's going to at the presidential level.
Okay, we're going to leave it there. As we wrap up this evening, let me invite you to our next Tocqueville event in just 3 weeks, November 13th through 14th, called The Black Experience in America. The event will feature professor, minister, theologian, New York Times columnist, and public intellectual Issa Macaulay, who will speak about his memoir titled How Far to the Promised Land, which recalls how he negotiated life as a black kid on the streets of Huntsville, Alabama, to his place of influence in majority white America. We will also do an experimental On Discourse event with Dr. Macaulay that you won't want to miss. So sign up for our emails so you get all the information, and you can do that on our website. So let's thank our speakers, and you are dismissed.